I learned a lot in my first year in Taiwan, but the more I learned, the more I realized that a single year would not be enough. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I am going to continue sharing the story of how I learned Chinese, and this will be the fourth installment in this little series, and I'll make sure to put links in the description to the other episodes if you want to check those out first. Before we get to that though, I'd like to mention that there is a speaking challenge on for April, and it starts on April 10th and lasts until the end of the month. And these challenges are always free to join, and it's just a way to encourage you to learn more. This week's article on Hacking Chinese contains a lot of information and inspiration for how to practice speaking, and it also contains simple instructions for how to join the challenge. This time, I will also randomly give out a prize to one active participant in the challenge, and this is a slot in my upcoming pronunciation course, which will open again for registration probably on May the 22nd. So if you've been putting off your speaking practice and need a good excuse to get started and maybe get some friendly competition with other people if you're into that, head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com. And of course, if you listen to this in the future and these dates have all passed, you can still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenge is on when you are listening. And of course, you can also head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com to see the current status of the pronunciation course. Okay, so let's get back to the topic of this episode, which is how I learned Chinese, and more specifically, it is my second year in Taiwan, which was my third year of learning Chinese overall. And so this episode covers the time period from autumn 2009 to the autumn of 2010. And since I don't expect everybody to have listened to the previous parts, or indeed remember what I said in the previous parts if you listen to them, I'll recap very briefly. So I started learning Chinese in 2007, mostly by accident or because I was interested in Chinese philosophy and culture, and then got an opportunity to learn Chinese, but it was never my intention to get stuck with it for 15 years. And this is what I covered in the first episode in this series. And then in the second episode, I talked about my first year of learning Chinese in Sweden, which was in a serious and fairly intensive university program, but still it was a fairly conventional foreign language experience at university. Then in the next episode, I talked about my first year in Taiwan, which kind of already implies that there is a second year and maybe a third and a fourth too, but we'll get to those later. In essence, I spent my first year in Taiwan at two different language schools, and I learned an awful lot of Mandarin during this time. And for me, this was also the first time I studied a language in an immersion environment like this. As I mentioned in the introduction, however, I also realized that even though I learned a lot, there are so many things left to learn, and if I'm going to do something serious with my Chinese, rather than just be able to talk with people, I needed more. And so I decided to stay for a second year. This decision is rather interesting and was one I spent a fair amount of time before making, and it's also a question that students sometimes ask me these days. How much Chinese do I need to learn before it becomes useful? And so I had studied for 2 years, I didn't feel that was enough. But then, of course, if you zoom out a bit, it's fairly easy to predict that if you study Chinese for 3 years, you will still think that there are more things to learn and that if you want to use it properly, you need to add another year. And then you can keep doing that for the rest of your life. Which would be fine if you enjoy learning Chinese and that is something you really want to do. But there are also other things in life, and I understand that most people are not learning Chinese only because it's the most interesting thing there is, but also maybe because they want it to be useful for something. And here I think there is an important misconception, especially among people who don't themselves learn languages or teach languages or care that much about languages in general. And that is that languages are useful when you reach a certain level. And this is simply not the case. Yes, it's true that the more you learn, the more useful it will be, but there is no sharp cut-off or any kind of threshold you get past, and then the language suddenly becomes useful. I think it's rather easy actually to argue that knowing one phrase in a language can be extremely useful. It shows that you are interested, it shows that you've made an effort, and if you use this phrase in the right situation, that can definitely be useful. You don't need to be fluent in the language for it to be useful. And then, of course, you can say, well, if I know two phrases, isn't that twice as likely to be useful? What if you then keep studying for a few weeks so you learn even more? Won't that be even more useful? Yes, of course it will. And I think the problem here is not that languages become more and more useful, it is that people don't really define or think about what they mean when they say useful. What do you want to use Chinese for? And many of you know what you want to use Chinese for, and then you have a clear idea of how much Chinese you actually need. At least there is a theoretical answer to this question. But if you don't have a clear application in mind, the idea of a language being useful is very hazy and not very useful, to be honest, in itself. Now, as my first year in Taiwan was drawing to a close, of course I were mindful of these things. I thought about what I would use Chinese for. And in this case, I did have a very clear application because I was halfway through a teaching program in Sweden, and originally I intended to teach English and Swedish. But now that I had Chinese, I felt that, well, it would be interesting to teach Chinese too, wouldn't it? And then my goal then was to acquire Chinese to a level where I felt that I could teach it in, say, high school. To do this, there are different kinds of requirements, of course. One is a formal requirement that says you have to have a certain number of credits and a certain level of language ability and so on. But I didn't care too much about that at the time. I was more after the feeling that I know enough Chinese to be able to teach it. And looking back, this is a little bit naive. I still think there are so many things in the Chinese language that I don't know and that I should know to be a good teacher. And I'm saying this 14 years after I made the decision to stay one more year. So I think that realistically, for some people, you will keep digging, you will keep exploring, and there will always be more things to learn. So the question isn't really, do I need to learn more? But it's more a competition with other activities. Maybe there are other things you want to learn or do in life. But anyway, I decided to stay for another year, and I think that that was a very good decision, because even though after the first year I was able to use Chinese fairly proficiently in everyday contexts, I feel that after that year I was able to use it in a much broader sense and at a much higher level. If I had gone back home after the first year, I do think that there is a chance that Chinese wouldn't have been such a large part of my life as it is now. But after staying in Taiwan for 2 years, I feel that I was pretty firmly on the path towards using Chinese professionally somehow. And of course, I could never have predicted what I'm doing now back then, but I wouldn't be super surprised back then if somebody said, hey, Ola, this is what you will do in 14 years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what I actually did in Taiwan during my second year. So the first semester I spent at National Taiwan Normal University. And if you have followed me for a while, you might know that I later ended up studying a graduate program for teaching Chinese as a second language, also at National Taiwan Normal University, but that was in 2012, so 3 years after the events we're talking about here. So my 2009 experience was in an undergraduate program for Chinese language and culture. So this was a normal university program, meaning that I did have subjects that normal Taiwanese students also have, such as English, which was a little bit weird. We also had physical education, which I mentioned in the previous podcast episode about learning Chinese through sports. And we also took part of campus life in various other shapes and forms. To be honest, I had a fairly rough start to this semester for several reasons. The most important one being that I couldn't find accommodation at first, and that was rather stressful. In addition to this, it was rather different studying in this program compared to normal language centers that I had experience of since my first year. And maybe the biggest difference was that the institution is much bigger, there is less wiggle room, there are more students, and the schedule is more fixed, and everything is basically just more regulated. It's worth noting that the campus was actually in Linkou, which is some distance from the Taipei city center and the NTNU campus there. And this was not a big problem for me once I actually found somewhere to live, but I know there were many other foreigners who enrolled in the courses, and some of them simply quit because they thought they would be in Taipei, but they actually were in Linkou, which is about, 40-50 minutes by bus outside the city center. Like I said, I didn't mind all that much, but I can imagine that there is a big surprise when you imagine being in an urban city center and you actually end up at a campus in a kind of rural area. I should also say that since then they have actually moved the program to the main campus in Taipei. So, what was it like then, after I had sorted all the practical issues out and classes actually started and I got to know my classmates, my schedule, and so on? Well, I think it was fairly traditional language teaching. We did have a lot of different courses on our schedule. We had listening class, we had conversation class, reading, and so on. And this is very traditional. This is how it works in most of East Asia. But the funny thing is, of course, that no matter what it says on the schedule, the contents are actually almost the same in every lesson, and it consists of going through texts and learning more words. So, for example, we spoke more Chinese in the listening class than we did in the conversation class, which I felt was rather odd. The students were divided into 3 groups by ability, and I was just barely able to squeeze in the A group, which was the most advanced one. And I'm very happy for that because I was able to then hang out and study with people whose Chinese was much better than mine. And as I've mentioned many times on the podcast, this type of environment is awesome for learning quickly. Naturally, it's also stressful sometimes to always feel that you are among the weaker students in your class and knowing that you have to spend twice as much time as some other people to accomplish the same tasks. But remember that language learning is not a competition, or at least it's not a competition against your classmates. They are your fellow travelers on the road to fluency, and if they are ahead of you, they will be better able to help you along. One thing I didn't like with the setup at NTNU was that we had almost too much time in class and too many assignments and too little time to compensate for all the things we didn't learn. Because if all your classes are the same, even though they have different names on the schedule, and they mostly contain memorizing vocabulary and reading texts, there are a lot of things that you're missing out on. And I can understand that if you're enrolled in a 4-year program, that was the idea in this program, then you have plenty of time to actually be able to implement all this at later stages. But the more I studied here and the longer I stayed, I felt that I'm probably not going to commit to this. I'm going to go back and finish my degree in Sweden after this year is over. And once I realized that, I also realized, okay, now I only have 1 semester left in an immersion environment, and then I will be back to Sweden, and I don't know if I will ever be in this kind of environment again. So it makes sense to make the most out of the time in that particular location. And so learning vocabulary from a book, reading a lot, and maybe even listening a lot, these are things that you can equally well do at home. And I knew that I could continue improving my reading ability in Sweden. I mean, of course, at this point I could already read quite well, and expanding my Chinese by reading even more is not exactly rocket science. I mean, it takes determination to do, but I could equally well do that in Sweden. I didn't need to be in Taiwan to do that. However, when it comes to interaction and communicating in Chinese, that is something that is significantly easier to do if everybody around you speaks the language. So, as I approached the end of the autumn, I decided to switch schools and abandon the program and move back to Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan and keep studying at Wenzhou. And I did choose to go back to Wenzhou for several reasons. Well, first, of course, I had had a very good experience there the previous spring, and I also knew many of the teachers there, so I could talk to them and discuss what my situation would be if I transferred. And so the decision was not all that complicated because I wanted to interact more and I was choosing between a class with maybe 5 or 6 classmates and one with some 20 classmates and a lot of passive learning. This turned out to be a very good decision, I think, because I ended up in a very small group at Wenzhou. There weren't that many students who had reached this level of Chinese, back then at least. And so we were only 5 plus me, and most of my classmates were usually busy with other things, and I've complained about this earlier on the podcast. What happens if you are very serious and spend all your time learning, but your classmates don't? But in this case, this was not a problem because they were so ahead of me in all regards that when they did turn up to class, they were still ahead of me even if I had prepared. And the good thing for me was that often they didn't even show up. So towards the end of the semester, I had lots of one-on-one tutoring because I was the only student that showed up. And sometimes we were 2, sometimes we were 3. And in this kind of environment, you can get so much support that simply isn't possible if you have 20 classmates. The schedule also allowed me to socialize much more with people outside of class and do something else than study textbooks, which was a nice change. Looking back at these 2 semesters, I think they complemented each other rather well, actually, because the first semester was very heavy on traditional studying, and then the second semester was all about implementing this in various contexts. As usual, it's very difficult to evaluate language proficiency, especially in hindsight, but I did write a progress report after leaving Taiwan, and it basically says that I was able to talk about most things, well, maybe not professional topics, but most things in everyday life or other things we came across in class with some fluency. I still thought that formal listening was difficult, so for example, listening to news broadcasts and things like that, but following along ordinary conversations or listening to interviews or radio programs and so on didn't pose much of a problem. For the stats geeks out there, I still kept a tally of how much Chinese I knew at this point, and I had 11,000 words in Anki, and it's a little bit hard to say how many individual characters I had, but I did go through the 3,000 most common ones to make sure I knew the basics, so I assume my total character count should be at around 3,500 or maybe 4,000. To round this episode off, I'd like to share a few things that I learned or took with me from my second year in Taiwan, and of course I don't mean language here, I mean about learning Chinese. So the first one is that going to class as an advanced student can still be very valuable, but that it is rather dependent on how many other people are in the class with you. So if you are in a small class, maybe 3-4 people, or maybe if you have a private tutor, this can be extremely helpful to push you to explore new ways of expressing yourself or improving the way you speak and so on. But if you have 20 classmates, you will also learn things, but you will learn different things. And these things are much easier to replicate on your own. And then the argument for enrolling in a class is much lower. The second point I want to bring up is that you really need to take responsibility for your own learning and make sure you cover the things you are missing in class. You cannot rely on your class providing everything you want. Not even the most competent teacher can do that or has the resources to do that, and you need to be in charge. And this is something I elaborated on in episode 108 if you want to learn more. Finally, if you are learning Chinese in the way I have, and this should be clear by now, if you have listened to this and the previous episodes, that I usually dive into the deep end of the pool. I try to find the most difficult learning environment I can, and then I make sure to stay afloat and hope I learn a lot along the way. That can work very well if you have the determination, the resources, and the energy to do it, and we discussed this in episode 80. But what I want to add here is that if you pursue this type of learning, it is important that you later take time to go back and cover things that you have missed, because there will be many of them. I might be reading newspapers and articles in a class, but I still don't know how to say light bulb and things like that. And if you want to achieve everyday proficiency and fluency, these words are kind of important. So just because you can do something that is labeled as being advanced does not mean that you have a solid foundation. And you need then to intersperse your deep end immersion projects with slower paced learning where you actually go through and make sure you haven't missed too many important things. And of course, you do that by doing lots of extensive listening and reading, because these common words that you might have missed, they will pop up all the time. It's just that you can't always pursue the most difficult thing to do, because you will end up with an ability that is just like a house of cards, in that it is very high and looks very fancy, but it is not very stable at all. This wraps up this episode about my second year in Taiwan, and next time I return to talking about how I learned Chinese, I will talk about the 2 years I spent in Sweden after returning from Taiwan, but before I enrolled in a graduate program for teaching Chinese as a second language. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.